¿Qué pasó? El rey de la geografía.
Hello, Kyle here, talking about road tripping along the US-Mexico border. It's not exactly the most heavily used route for road trippers, as with the Eastern time zone being the most heavily populated part of the country and California being the most populous state, usually road tripping is used as a means to get from one end of the country to the other, or if you live in the middle of the country, as a means to get to one ocean or the other. And you'll probably be taking one of the most direct routes to do it, and the Mexican border route isn't the most direct route for really anybody. But it's a nice route. It's much prettier than you might think. It's got a lot of mountains, some canyons, some national parks and state parks. It's a very pretty drive along most of it. And in this video, I want to go over some of the highlights of this route and why you should consider it on a road trip. I want to first define what I mean when I say border route. There is no road that actually follows the entire US-Mexico border, and at some points you might be 10 miles, 20 miles or more from the border. But if you're driving this far south, you're on the border. And if you're taking these roads that are the closest to Mexico that you can get, you're taking the border route. I also want to address a concern that a lot of people have about crime along the border. And yes, the Mexican side of the border can be very dangerous. And not just the big cities, some of the medium-sized cities too. And therefore, I can't really recommend crossing the border in most parts along this route. But the US side of the border is perfectly safe. You're no more likely to be a victim of crime here than you are anywhere else in the US. So don't be worried about getting caught up in drug cartel activity or being kidnapped or anything. And there are 3 specific spots that I'll mention later in this video where it is perfectly safe to cross the border into Mexico, but for most of the route, don't cross the border. The easternmost point along the border at the Gulf of Mexico is near Brownsville, Texas. There's not a whole lot to recommend about Brownsville. There's not a lot there for the tourist. Most people traveling this far south are coming to visit South Padre Island, which is a national seashore. There's some nice beaches there, some spots you can camp on the beach. The town itself is kind of a party town for the 18 to 25-year-old crowd. It's a popular spot for spring break, so it's busy there in March and April. I'm way too old for that, so I'm not going down there for spring break. But it is probably pretty fun for the younger crowd. And this part of Texas, the very deep south part, Brownsville, McAllen, Edinburgh, Mission, the Rio Grande Valley area, is probably the least interesting part of the border for visitors, so it's the part that I recommend the least. One place that I like that I can recommend stopping at for a couple hours is Laredo, Texas. The reason why I like Laredo is because it's the only truly Mexican city in the US. I've been to all the border towns, and Laredo is the only one that is a Mexican city. All the other ones are American cities with a large Mexican population. But Laredo, with the downtown layout, the streets, the types of stores they have there, the types of restaurants, it really does feel like you're in Mexico without crossing the border. And with 95% of the population that lives there being Mexican, it does feel pretty authentic. In fact, the last time I was there, I only saw 2 other gringos. One was this old redneck, old hippie looking dude. I can't tell the difference. Old rednecks and old hippies look the same. But this guy speaking to a guy in English, the other guy speaking back to him in Spanish. I thought that was pretty cool. The only other gringo I saw down there was a bum. A guy sitting on the street with a cardboard sign that says, help me, I'm homeless, whatever. The kind of guy that you would normally kick. But yeah, it felt pretty authentic down there. I mean, I'm just kidding. I don't kick homeless people anymore. But I can recommend Laredo as a spot to stop for a couple hours. I can't recommend going way out of the way to visit it. But if you are driving the border route and you're coming down from San Antonio, following the road from Laredo to El Paso, or on the other direction, I can recommend stopping there for a couple hours. Heading west out of Laredo, it starts to get into some pretty empty country, so make sure you're gassed up leaving Laredo, as there aren't many spots to stop between there and the next town. The next 2 border towns you'll reach are Eagle Pass and Del Rio, neither of which are too terribly exciting, and their corresponding border towns of Piedras Negras and Acuña are no longer as safe as they used to be, so I can't recommend crossing the border there. But if you are interested in mostly seeing the pretty scenery, some of the nice mountains and things along the border, and you're taking I-10 as your road trip route, when you get to Sonora, Texas, you can cut down to Del Rio and follow the route from Del Rio to Van Horn. It's very pretty, and that's my favorite part of the Mexican border route. Not too far from Del Rio is Seminole Canyon State Park. This is a nice park with some scenery that you wouldn't expect to find in Texas. It's got some good spots to camp and some nice hiking trails. I was camping there, opened up my tent and saw a couple of giant jackrabbits hopping around. I was like, man, those are some big ass bunnies, but Seminole Canyon State Park, worth checking out. Heading west from there, you'll again enter some pretty empty country, so once again, make sure you're gassed up leaving Del Rio. If you're driving this far south, it probably means you're interested in visiting Big Bend National Park. This is one of my favorite national parks. It's very lightly visited, and with there being no accommodation anywhere near there, the only people you're going to see are a handful of RV trippers and some campers. But there's some nice hiking trails and a cool campground there. And even if you're not going to do any hiking, the drive through the park is very nice. Some cool turnouts and some spots to get pictures of the scenery. And one of the 3 spots where I can recommend crossing the border into Mexico that's perfectly safe is from Big Bend National Park. You'll take a little ferry, it's really just a little fisherman's boat, across the river into a small little town called Boquilla del Carmen. Very small town. Couple of restaurants, couple of bars, couple of shops. That's about it. The entire economy of this town is based on people coming over the border from Big Bend National Park. But beware, this border crossing is closing, opening on a whim. You never know if it's open or closed, so check before you go down there to make sure you can cross the border. But Big Bend National Park, great spot to visit, highly recommended. Leaving Big Bend National Park, you'll have the option of taking Highway 385 up to Marathon or State Highway 118 up to Alpine. 118 is much slower, but it's also much more scenic, going over some pretty high mountains. And you don't really think of Texas when you think of high mountains, but there actually are quite a few decently high peaks there. In the entire eastern U.S., there are only 10 peaks above 6,000 feet. But in Texas, in an area just the size of Connecticut, there are 58 peaks above 6,000 feet, of which 52 are above 7,000 feet and 11 that are above 8,000 feet. So some decently high mountains there. And there's some good spots to camp. Davis Mountain State Park is a pretty cool spot. And Marathon and Alpine, both of these towns are pretty small, not a whole lot to see there, but you'll probably end up stopping at one or the other to get gas or to get something to eat. And then you'll end up in Van Horn, Texas, and there's really nothing to see there at all, but you'll have to go through there to catch up with I-10. And there is no route that follows the border along this area, so you'll have to use Interstate 10 between Van Horn and El Paso. I kind of like El Paso. The first time I visited there, I was like, man, this place is a dump. But it's since grown on me. I'm not sure why. But anyway, one thing that's very interesting about El Paso is that it's right across the border from Juarez, Mexico. And Juarez is notorious for being one of the most dangerous cities in the world. And for a big chunk of the early 2000s, Juarez was the single most dangerous city on the planet outside of areas that are war-torn like Syria or Yemen or Somalia. But El Paso is one of the safest cities in the U.S. So this is kind of an interesting fact about El Paso, but whether you like El Paso or not, you're going to be going through it. Leaving El Paso, you'll enter New Mexico. A early diversion 2 hours north of El Paso is White Sands National Monument. This place is pretty cool, just giant areas of big white sand dunes, and there isn't a whole lot to do there. You just drive through the park, get out, take a few pictures at some of the viewpoints, and walk on the sands a little bit. But it's a very unique site that you're not going to see anywhere else in the U.S. Or after El Paso, you can take New Mexico State Highway 9 west across the Boot Heel, and the Boot Heel is it's this area right here. You know I love New Mexico and I have a map of it on my wall, but anyway, driving across the Boot Heel is pretty cool. Some really nice scenery. You'll enter Arizona and meet up with State Highway 80, which will take you through both Bisbee and Tombstone. Bisbee's a neat little town. It's got some little art galleries, a funky historic downtown, so it's worth checking out. Tombstone's an Old West it's really touristy. It's kind of cheesy. You get the folks that dress up in their period costumes and, give you a stagecoach ride. So it's kind of cool. It's worth seeing if you want to see some Old West ghost town kind of stuff. It's a lot better than, say, Dodge City, Kansas, which is way off the interstate, and you go that far out of the way and you'll be like, man, I went out of the way for this. But Tombstone isn't really that far out of the way, so it's worth checking out. And if you're using Interstate 10 as your road trip route, it's worth taking a little diversion on Arizona State Highway 80 through both Bisbee and Tombstone, and you'll meet back up with I-10. Heading west, you'll descend from the higher elevations into the classic scenery of the desert Southwest. You'll go across the Tohono Indian Reservation and on into Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, which has some good hiking and some nice wilderness camping. And this is the second of the 3 spots where I can recommend crossing over into Mexico where it's perfectly safe. the town of Lukeville, Arizona, and the border town of Sonoita, Mexico are not very interesting, but the reason why you cross here is to drive about an hour or so south to the beach resort town of Puerto Penasco, or it's usually called Rocky Point. It's at the northern end of the Sea of Cortez. It's pretty touristy. You'll see mostly Americans there. It's kind of like a mini Cabo San Lucas, but it's perfectly safe. You don't have to worry about a lot of the hassles you have at other parts of the Mexican border. So if you're looking to dip your toe into the shallow end of Mexico, this is the place to do it. So go down there, go to the beach, drink a few margaritas, have some shrimp tacos, and you'll have a good time. You'll need to use Interstate 8 to get across the rest of Arizona, as there's a big Air Force base there and the roads are closed to the public. But then you'll enter California just outside of Yuma, and when you first get to California, you'll see the most disgusting rest stop in the entire country. So it's like, hey, welcome to California. Here's a really gross rest area. But this is low desert, a lot of sand dunes, a lot of cacti, so some pretty cool scenery. And the third spot where it's perfectly safe to cross over into Mexico is into the town of Tecate. And you might know Tecate from the high-end, classy beer they make there, but this is a small town. It's much more laid back, some spa resorts. You're into Mexico's wine country, and this isn't one of those border towns you visit to party and drink and pass out in the streets and stuff. So much quieter, much more laid back, and perfectly safe to visit. Then you'll cross over some mountains into San Diego, and San Diego is definitely worth stopping at. It's a great spot to visit, and it's a nice reward as the end of your trip along the border. And that, in a nutshell, is the Mexican border route. I really like this route. It's unique, and I like to recommend spots to visit that are unlike anywhere else in the U.S. And of course, there's nowhere else in the U.S. that's like the Mexican border route. So if you're interested in doing something that's a little bit different, off the beaten path, and going on a road trip route that most people aren't going to do, this is a great route. And like I was saying at the beginning of the video, it's a lot prettier than you might think. There's a lot more opportunities for outdoor activities than you might think, and you'll have a good time. A couple of bits of housekeeping here. First, if you are going to cross the border, make sure you have your passport with you, as you're going to need it. And also, you're going to go through a bunch of Homeland Security Border Patrol checkpoints. I mean, a bunch. I lost track of how many I went through, at least 15 or 20, and there's a whole bunch of them. Every time you stop at one, they're going to walk a canine drug-sniffing dog around your car. So if you have anything illegal in your car, don't take this route. And if you are going to take this route, make sure you don't have anything illegal in your car, because it's not a situation where they're going to wave 9 cars by and just stop a few random ones. They're going to stop every single car and walk that drug-sniffing dog around every single car. So don't go this way if you got drugs in your car. And also, it's not just along the border. They have these drug checkpoints that are 50 miles away from the border. So don't go anywhere near the border if you're carrying stuff in your car that might be illegal. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, give me a like, a nice thumbs up to let me know you liked it, and let me know in the comment section if you are familiar with this route and things are different than how I described it in this video, because the situation can change along the border. Some of the places can become more dangerous, some can become safe to visit, and some of the border crossing can open and close on a whim. So again, let me know if things are different than how I described them. But if you are interested in road tripping and U.S. travel and geography stuff, subscribe to my channel, as I'll be posting a lot of videos on road tripping and U.S. travel and geography stuff. So again, thank you for watching. Geography King signing out, and about to go make my own shrimp tacos.